40 years ago this month, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported unusual clusters of rare forms of pneumonia in 5 gay men in Los Angeles. Over the next 18 months, more clusters were discovered in otherwise healthy men throughout the country. These were the first signs of an epidemic that would go on to claim the lives of 34.7 million people around the world and continues to kill almost 500,000 people every year. That disease, AIDS, and the stigma attached to the disease, which was heavily associated with gay men, caused many to suffer and die alone and in silence. My generation, and especially those younger than me, were too young to remember the horrors of the heights of the AIDS crisis, which is why it is important to share the stories of those who were in the thick of it. Today, I'm going to tell one of those stories. The story of Ruth Coker Burks, the cemetery angel. Ruth was born in Hot Springs in 1959. During her earliest years, her mother was hospitalized with tuberculosis for an extended period of time, leaving her father to care for her. She developed a close relationship with her father until his death in 1964, when Ruth was only 5 years old. She says that her mother was emotionally distant and sometimes put her into a local children's home. Ruth remembers hoping that every phone call was her mother coming back for her, that she felt abandoned, and her later actions were based on how she had wished that people had treated her then. For almost a century, Ruth's family had been buried in Files Cemetery in Hot Springs. When she was young, her mother had gotten into a final epic row with her brother and bought all of the empty plots to prevent him or his family from being buried with the rest of the family. Some Sundays after church, Ruth's mother would take her to visit the cemetery, and her mother would sarcastically remark, "Someday, all of this is going to be yours." Ruth said, "I always wondered what I was going to do at the cemetery. Who knew there'd come a time when people didn't want to bury their children?" Ruth was introduced to the AIDS crisis early on. After hearing stories of a gay plague on the news, she contacted her gay cousin in Hawaii out of concern for him. He downplayed its seriousness, telling her not to worry. However, she did worry, and her worry led to her reading everything she could find about the disease, hoping to reassure herself that he was right. In 1984, Ruth was visiting University Hospital in Little Rock, where she was helping care for a friend suffering from cancer. That was when she noticed a door with a big red bag over it. The nurses were literally drawing straws to go into the room. Those who would lose would beg to draw again, or to go best 2 out of 3. Finally, curiosity got the better of Ruth, and she snuck into the room. Inside the room, she found Jimmy, a skeletal young man, wasted to less than 100 pounds, and suffering from a disease then known as GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. She could tell that he was near death. Ruth took Jimmy's hand, rubbed his arm, and asked if there was anything he needed or anything she could do for him. When he asked for his mother, she thought that would be an easy job to accomplish. Ruth thought that a simple phone call would bring his mother to him, and Ruth could move on with her life. Emerging from Jimmy's room, she was questioned by the nurses. Upon telling them that he wished to see his mother, the nurses laughed her off, saying that his mother was not coming. Ruth badgered the nurses until they gave her his mother's phone number, but they refused to let her use the phone at the nurses' station, instead sending her to a payphone down the hall. Ruth called Jimmy's mother, and the woman almost immediately hung up on her, saying, "I don't have a son, and don't call me back." Ruth called again, this time telling his mother, "If you hang up on me again, I will put your son's obituary in your hometown newspaper, and I will list his cause of death." This time, his mother stayed on the line long enough to explain to Ruth that her son was a sinner. She didn't know what was wrong with him, and she didn't care. She wasn't coming to the hospital, as he was already dead to her. She wouldn't even claim his body when he died. This was the first, but far from the last time Ruth would hear this from a patient's parent. She planned to tell him the truth, that his mother wasn't coming. But as she entered the room, Jimmy turned to her and said, "Oh, Mama, I knew you'd come." She took his hand and said, "I'm here, honey, I'm here." Ruth pulled a chair up to his bedside and talked with him, holding his hand, bathing his face, and telling him that she was there. She promised him that she would take him to her beautiful little cemetery where her daddy and grandparents were buried, and they would watch out over him. She sat with Jimmy for 13 hours until he took his last breath on earth. Determined to keep her promise, Ruth tried to find a funeral home who would take care of Jimmy's body, but she was turned away by people who thought it was too risky until she managed to find an establishment in Pine Bluff that agreed to cremate him. She paid for it with her own savings. Jimmy's ashes were returned to her in a cardboard box. Ruth got a chipped cookie jar from a friend who worked at Dryden Pottery, and with that as an urn, she went to Files Cemetery. Using a post hole digger, she dug a hole in the middle of her father's grave and buried Jimmy's remains. She said that she knew Daddy would love that about her, and that she would be able to find the urn if she ever needed to. Having been rebuffed by multiple ministers and preachers, Ruth said her own prayers over the grave and returned home. At the time, she thought Jimmy would be the only one. She thought, surely somebody's coming. She believed that there would be a massive worldwide push for a cure or treatment of the disease, like had been done for polio and TB. Unfortunately, that was not the case. Recognizing how many AIDS patients were alone, Ruth became a constant presence at the hospitals and took it upon herself to see that when they died, they were cremated and the ashes properly taken care of. She became the go-to person in Arkansas for the care and comfort of dying AIDS patients. Along with their gay friends and companions, Ruth served as hospice for those dying of AIDS. She had referrals from rural hospitals all over the state, and over the course of more than a decade, cared for more than 1,000 AIDS patients. She arranged housing and ransacked supermarket dumpsters at dawn for food for her patients until Bill Clinton, then governor of Arkansas and a childhood friend, directed food banks to help her. Her early efforts were funded from her own savings, but as word of her work spread, she received considerable funding assistance for funerals and medications from gay dance clubs around the state, who would hold drag shows to raise money for Ruth to spend on medication and rent. Despite a lack of medical experience or training, Ruth took care of those suffering from AIDS during an era when the time between diagnosis and death was often measured in weeks. She took them to appointments, picked up their medications, assisted in filling out applications for assistance, and served as a human contact. She recalled many times that she would order a pizza and sit with dying men as they filled out their own death certificates. They had to fill them out before they died, because Ruth knew that she would have no way of getting the requisite information, such as a mother's maiden name, from the families of the men. She would take blood samples to the few doctors who would accept them, although many demanded that she come by after hours at the back door, and get a diagnosis, which she would relay to a friend in Washington, D.C., who had access to some of the early research for disease treatment. She would then get the local doctor to write the necessary prescription, and Ruth would pick it up from the rare pharmacy that actually provided such medication. Today she still has a large coffee can full of 30-year-old pens. Once pharmacy clerks learned that she worked with AIDS patients, she said that many of them would insist she keep the pen after signing a check, then follow her out the door with a can of Lysol. Medication like AZT was hard to come by, and she accumulated her own underground pharmacy, stocked primarily with medication that people had left behind when they died. They would be repurposed to help those who couldn't get drugs of their own. Ruth felt ostracized. Her church ejected her from its finance committee. Members of the church would not drink the coffee she made or the food she touched. Children stopped inviting her daughter to birthday parties, and the KKK twice burned crosses on her lawn. But she persisted, in part because she thought she had a divine calling. She said that she was doing what God had asked of her, and all she did was pray, asking God, "If this is what you want me to do, just please don't let me or my daughter get it." They didn't. Ruth's stories from that time border on nightmarish, watching one person after another waste away before her eyes. She was there when they took their last breaths. She took deathbed confessions. She would sometimes go to 3 funerals a day, including those where family members would point at an open casket and say, "This is what happens when you sin," or where those preaching the funeral would call the disease God's retribution for a gay lifestyle. One mother called Ruth and demanded to know how much longer it would be before her son died, because he was holding up their lives, and he had ruined their lives. Her son, Billy, was one of the youngest victims Ruth ever cared for. He was also a drag queen. Ruth still has one of his dresses in her closet. Once, she took Billy to the ER for a problem not related to HIV. The hospital refused to let him enter, and they called the police to escort him to jail. Billy was not escorted by police, however, because the officer was unwilling to place him in the vehicle. A few weeks before Billy died, he had withered away to only 55 pounds. Ruth had taken him to an appointment in Little Rock. Afterward, they were driving around town, trying to get his spirits up. They drove past the zoo and saw someone riding an elephant. Billy commented, "You know, I've never ridden an elephant." Ruth said, "Well, we'll fix that." She turned the car around and, clad in her dress and heels, accompanied a smiling Billy atop an elephant. Ruth never wore gloves unless the patients had broken skin. She believes that touching them kept those she cared for alive longer than others. By the 1990s, experts in the field were beginning to take notice. Ruth's patients lived 2 years longer than the national average. Researchers from the National Institutes of Health and the CDC would visit Ruth to see what she was doing that helped them live longer. She credits love, saying, "They were like my children, even though I was burying people my age." She always made a last effort to reach out to families before burying the patients. They usually hung up on her. Sometimes they cursed at her. Some of them prayed over the phone, not for her, but at her, as though she was a demon. When it came time, she worked with the same funeral home in Pine Bluff and pottery company. Her daughter, Allison, would join her in the burials. Dressed in their Sunday best, Ruth with her post-hole diggers and Allison with her little plastic spade, they would bury the urns in the ground of Files Cemetery and have a do-it-yourself funeral for the men. She believes that the number buried there is 43, but isn't sure. She said that she would sometimes get phone calls from people saying they had their lover's ashes and now they were sick, asking if they could spread the ashes in the cemetery. Ruth would tell them to go to the cemetery, walk around, and spread the ashes wherever felt right. For many of those who died, Ruth is now the only person who knows the location of their graves. This is how she became known as the Cemetery Angel. Around 1995, Ruth bought what would be her final cookie jar. She thought there would be somebody else, that the jar would eventually be filled. But there was no one else. She still keeps the empty jar. Ruth expressed hopes of developing a memorial at Files Cemetery and began raising money to turn it into a garden and a place where people could meditate and reflect. A landscape architect volunteered to create a design for the memorial garden, which will feature a weeping angel statue, a plaque telling the story of Ruth and her guys, and a list of the names of those who were lost. As of January 2021, 50 rose bushes have been planted in Files Cemetery. She also intends to set up some kind of trust to care for the cemetery after she's gone. Her memoir, All the Young Men, was published in 2020, and Ruth has since begun working with film producer Christina Wam on a project based on her life. Ruth remains an outspoken advocate for better understanding of HIV and AIDS. In 2013, she appeared on television to speak on behalf of 3 disabled, elementary school-aged foster children in Pea Ridge who had been suspended from school because the superintendent had heard that someone in the family had AIDS. After her appearance, Burks was denied a job that was specifically designed for her. However, there have been accolades as well. Ruth has been interviewed by media around the world and recognized by humanitarian organizations. In 2016, she was honored by Broadway Sings for Pride and New York City Pride Week. In 2017, a short video, Ruth, directed by Rose McGowan, was released. That year also saw Ruth receive the Tom Wayand Unsung Hero Award from the National AIDS Memorial Grove in San Francisco. As time marches forward, and we move further and further away from the height of the AIDS epidemic, it becomes more and more important that we remember and tell the stories of the people like Ruth, and like Billy and Jimmy, and so many more people who lost their lives during this dark time. This is especially true during the month of June, when we recognize LGBTQ plus Pride Month. It should be remembered that Pride Month is not simply about celebrations and parades, but also about honoring the legacy of those who came before us, those who walked a rougher road, and those who are no longer with us. For more information on Ruth, check the references in the description box. And for resources on HIV and AIDS prevention and care in Arkansas, visit healthy.arkansas.gov/programs-services/topics/HIV-prevention. This is Mapstronaut. Thank you for watching.